She once told me that she was the most published author I had never heard of. The same may be true for you, but you, like me, will be delighted to meet her because you're in for a treat as we share a lovely visit with one of America's most published and beloved authors on today's The Inside Story, Conversations on the Art and Heart of Writing.
Welcome to another episode of The Inside Story, exclusively on Liftable.tv. They say everyone has a book in them, but turning that desire into a compelling story can seem overwhelming. That's where The Inside Story comes in. Your host, Walt Larimore, is himself an author of over 40 books. Walt's goal in every episode is to inspire and entertain you by spending quality time with best-selling authors and having conversations about the art and the heart of writing. In this episode, you'll be encouraged and equipped to lean into your own writing dream and pick up some insider tips and tricks of the trade. Grab a cup of coffee and get ready for The Inside Story on Liftable.tv.
Hi everyone, I'm Walt Larimore, and I'm so glad you're joining me in my home library for The Inside Story. Our guest today writes romance novels and contemporary women's fiction. 6 of her novels have become made-for-TV movies, and her Cedar Grove series of novels was adapted into a television series of the same name. She's a multiple New York Times best-selling author with 13 of those novels hitting the #1 spot. She's one of today's most popular writers. The Inside Story is delighted to welcome Debbie Macomber. Hi, Debbie.
Hello, Walt.
You know, I remember when we first met, it was in the green room of this massive TV studio. I think it was South Bend, Indiana. It must have been 15, 20 years ago. We were sitting there. We had never met. And you introduced yourself. You said that you were the most published author that I had never heard of. And I was the least published author that you had never heard of. But you treated me with such kindness and such encouragement. And as a young author, I've never forgotten that day. And I just wanted to say thanks.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was a pleasure to meet you. I enjoyed every minute of it.
It was fun. And as I've talked to others who know you, they say the same thing about Debbie Macomber. I mean, I think we both know people who really sell a lot and maybe they change a little bit. I don't think you have. And I think that's neat.
God keeps me humble. Trust me in that.
Oh, amen. So where were you born, Debbie?
I was born and raised in Yakima, Washington, which is right in the center of the state.
You grew up there with siblings?
Just one brother.
One brother. And tell me about your mom and dad.
Well, they met just before World War II and were married. My dad I think he was drafted and he went off to war. But before he left for overseas, he called my mom or texted, probably sent her a telegram and said, let's get married. She hopped on a train, went to Macon, Georgia to meet my dad. They got married and she didn't see him for almost 2.5 years. Dad fought in World War II. He was a prisoner of war. I have the most precious item in my mother's diary where it took several weeks for her to get the information that Dad had been taken captive. And, every entry was no letter from Ted, no letter from Ted. And then, oh God, please. And then she got the word that he had been taken as a POW. They were married 60 years.
Wow. Now, did he fight on the Pacific front or the European front? Or
in Germany. He was captured in Germany. Well, captured outside of Germany and then taken into Germany.
Yeah. Now, was he on the northern front from D-Day or the southern front from Italy?
Northern front. He came over on D-Day.
We'll have to talk sometime to see if our dads ever met on that war. But let's go back to the start of your faith journey, your spiritual path. How did it begin?
Well, I was raised in the church, in the Catholic church. I attended Catholic girls' school for high school and married young. Wayne and I met when I was 18 and we married when I was 19. So I married as a teenager. We had the 2 babies, 2 little girls, and I moved into a neighborhood and the ladies there I had a Bible study. And so they invited me to the Bible study. And that's when I understood that I needed to make Christ a part of my life. It wasn't just going to church that made me a Christian. And so that was, and boy, did it ever take root. I mean, those women, I grew in them. They mentored me. And it was when I found Christ that I realized that I could pursue my dream as a writer.
Oh, but you had some learning difficulties as a child, didn't you?
Yes, I'm dyslexic. My dad was too, and probably my grandpa. I didn't learn to read until the 5th grade. And in the 3rd grade, I can remember the teacher telling my mother, Debbie's a nice little girl, but she's never going to do well in school. And I didn't. I mean, I feel fortunate to have graduated from high school. I was always at the bottom of my class.
So to be dyslexic and then to become a writer, how did you overcome that, or how did you deal with that?
Well, I didn't know I was dyslexic. I just thought I had a lower IQ. It was only when my own children, when the boys were diagnosed as being dyslexic, that I understood that's what I was. But even being dyslexic, I realized that's actually a gift that God gave me because of that, I'm creative. I mean, I joke around. I say that I'm so right-brained. I walk with a limp. It's just, I learned, you don't overcome dyslexia. You just learn to cope with it and deal with it. I mean, to this day, I'm a very creative speller. And that's just part of being dyslexic. Thankfully, I have Shauna, my assistant, who reads and corrects my spelling.
I have Barb who reads and corrects mine. So actually, you sort of think with a limp, right?
Yeah, I do, but it's a very creative limp.
Our daughter, our oldest daughter, Kate, has cerebral palsy, so she has no right brain, half of a left brain. And Kate says, I both walk with a limp and I think with a limp, but that's how God created me. And I think there's some wonderful truth to that. So how did you begin writing? How did that start?
Well, it was always a dream I held in my heart. I mean, the best way I can think to explain it, I grew up making up stories. I would go to sleep at night making up stories. That was just part of my whole personality, and the love of my life was thinking one day I would write a book. And I think if you burn yourself, you hurt, the pain throbs. But every time I thought about being a writer, I throbbed with joy. There would be this happy anticipation that would come over me. But it was because I had such a negative background, it was something so easy to shove into the future. I had a lot of reasons why I shouldn't be a writer or couldn't be a writer. But then in the late 70s, I had a cousin I grew up with that I was very close to that got leukemia. And he was in the hospital in Seattle. And I mean, this is a really good story for people who have a dream, because I went to visit him and I got lost in the hospital. And I asked the doctor, how do I get from here to there? And he said, it's really easy. You just go down the hallway, take the first right, go all the way to the end and walk through the door marked absolutely no admittance. And, that's what we have to do when we have a dream. We have to be willing to walk through that door. And that was a catalyst. After David died, it was as if God was saying to me, I made you a writer. You have to have the faith to step forward and do it. And that was with the rented typewriter on the kitchen table.
I read that you sat in your kitchen with a rented typewriter to develop your first manuscript. What type of typewriter was it?
Oh, heavens, I don't know. I think Smith and Corona. Was that? I'm not even sure. It was one of those old black ones with the keys. They had electric typewriters, but the rental was more than we could afford for the month. So I just had a manual. And so it was on the kitchen table, and then I moved it at meal times, put it back on, and I loved it. The minute I sat down, I loved it. I love it to this day.
I the same way. I learned to type on a typewriter when I was a kid, and we had my original one. And then when we moved up here about 20 years ago, our kids friends were helping move, and one of Scott's friends started looking at that typewriter. She was just staring at it. Her name was Kaylee Kay. And she said, Dr. Walt, what is this? And I said, well, Kaylee Kay, what do you think it is? And she said, I think it must have been one of the early computer keyboards. And she had never seen a typewriter. And don't you know, it's come around. We were in a computer store not too long ago, and they have a keyboard, Debbie, that looks like a typewriter, and it even has the little handle, that you can
Really?
push to go to the next line. I almost bought it, but it's just too expensive. Well, so here you are, a mom at the kitchen table, the manual typewriter. But you're balancing being a wife, a mom, a writer with a dream. How was that balance for you?
Oh, well, it worked out fine. I learned that I gave the children's the morning. This is during the summertime, when they were home. The mornings were theirs. I would take them to the swimming pool, and then I would have an hour and a half to write. And I would write like crazy and then go back and get the kids. So they were always my priority, but they understood that it was important for their mom to have that time. And when you pursue your dream, they soon realized I was a happier person. I was a better mom and a better wife because I was able to do what I really loved.
But I did read that you and Wayne at one point, do you keep writing? Do you not keep writing? How did that balance work out?
Well, what happened was Wayne worked as a construction electrician, which meant we could count on him working about 9 months of the year. But in down economical times, there were some really hard months. And Wayne had been out of work for several months, and he'd gone in to pay bills. And he came out and he just had this horrible look on his face. And he said, we can't make the car payment this month. He said, I know you love being a writer, Debbie, and I know that this is important to you, but I really need you to get a job because we're going to need some extra income. I mean, it's hard to survive on unemployment. And so I took the newspaper. This is back in the days when you could circle jobs to apply for. And there were 3 jobs I thought I could possibly get. But remember, I married as a teenager. I have no other job skills. I'm a good mom and a good wife, but there's little call for that outside of the home. And I went to bed that night and I just couldn't sleep. My heart was so heavy. And I thought, God, you gave me this dream. You gave me the desire to be a writer. I'm going to have to give it back to you because I can't do it all. I mean, the kids were in sports and scouts and church and dance. There was all of their activities, keeping up the house and working 40 hours a week. What was going to have to go was that dream. And so I gave it back to God. And about 3 or 4 in the morning, Wayne woke up and he said, "Are you awake?" And I said, "You know what, honey, I haven't been to sleep." And he says, "Well, what's wrong?" And I said, I really think I could have made it as an author. I really do. He didn't say anything for a long time, but then he sat up and he said, "All right, honey, go for it. Go for it." And I had been writing for 2.5 years, and I wish I could say, Walt, I'm just so talented, I sold right away. But it was another 2.5 years before I sold that first book.
And yet you had that support. And what did that mean? I can't even imagine how important that was.
It meant everything. It meant everything. And when I say there were sacrifices, there were sacrifices, lots of sacrifices.
So Debbie, was that time the darkest hour for you as a writer?
Not quite. The darkest hour was yet to come. I realized, you have to remember, I was taking $100 a month out of our family budget. That's just what it cost for the rental of the typewriter, for the books I was buying, for the supplies I needed. And you have to remember, because I'm so dyslexic, I had to pay someone to type up the manuscripts at $1 a page. So I was taking this money out of a very tight budget. And after that night, when Wayne, gave me the possibility of pursuing my dream, I decided I had to start bringing in at least $100 a month for what I was taking out of the family budget. So I started selling articles. And I can tell you, the first thing I sold, you'll just love this one. Walt. It was the story of our son, Dale, the youngest boy, was in the Christmas program at church, and his entire role was to step forward and recite his Bible verse. And he was 5 years old in front of the whole church, and he knew that Bible verse. He said it back and forth all the way to church. And when he got up in front, he just froze. He said the verse and forgot the reference. And he just looks to me like, Mom, help me, help me. So I went, it's Luke. It's Luke. And Dale squares his shoulders and he goes, Luke Skywalker. I sold that for $5. Validation. Celebrate those little successes along the way. $5. And so I started routinely selling more and more articles. And here's another one. You'll love this story too. Our son Ted had prayed and God answered his prayer. He was so excited. He came running in to tell me that God had answered his prayer. And he said, I'm going to be a missionary for Jesus. And I said, well, Ted, don't go any farther in darkest Africa. Be home by dinner time. And so,
now, I do hear some of these writing teacher people say, encourage young writers to, publish articles, to publish short stories first before you go to longer manuscripts. That was the path you took. Do you recommend it for others?
No, not at all. Not at all, because I was writing the longer books. I was still doing that. I was doing this on the side just to bring in the extra income.
How many rejections did you get? I mean, we all get them, but before you had the first long manuscript, before the book accepted, you said, 5 years? And how many rejections?
I didn't count them, but I will say this, that every time I got one, it was like a hit. A physical hit. And what's kind of amazing is as when we moved, I was going through the pile of rejections I had, and one of them said, we can't buy this manuscript. It doesn't suit our needs at this time, but do you have anything else? I never saw that. Do you see anything else? Because all I could see and feel was that rejection.
And would you say a dozen, 2 dozen, 50? Do you remember?
Oh, because I was doing manuscripts, huge projects. It wasn't like, I have 2 dozen, because there were only so many publishers that were out there that were accepting manuscripts that I was writing. So every major publisher at one time or another rejected me.
I've heard you tell the story about going to a writer's conference. Before I head to this story, are you recommending to young writers that they go to writers' conferences? Do you think that's wise?
I do. I do think it's wise. If for no other reason that you meet other writers and you need that companionship, that fellowship, that encouragement that you get. My daughter said something I thought was so wise the other day. I was doing a video for an interview for another author, asking questions, as this is her first book. And so many people say, well, you're so supportive of other writers. And the thing is, other writers are not our competition. Our competition is movies. Our competition is people. We want people to read. And the competition is everything else that prevents them from reading. Social media, Netflix, all of that. So to be an encouragement and that's what you need. And you get that from other writers.
And then you went to a writer's conference, you took a manuscript, and it was actually critiqued. How did that go?
Oh my goodness. This was the darkest hour, really dark. And this is an amazing story when you think about God's hand in my life. I had got my first big sale, $300 for an article I had written. And that was so much money. Wayne and I are trying to decide how we're going to spend. We never had an extra $300. I mean, this was amazing. And Wayne says, why don't you take some of that money and attend a writer's conference? And it just so happened there was going to be one that summer. And I signed up for it, and I got a letter saying that there were 2 editors from the very house that I had been submitting my work, and they had agreed to read 10 manuscripts, 5 each. And so I immediately submitted my synopsis in the first 3 chapters of my current book, which I loved. I love this book. If anything I ever sold, it would be this book. And I knew it. I just had that feeling. And sure enough, my manuscript was chosen as one of the 10 to be reviewed. And even now, all these years later, I can remember how I felt when I got that letter, that feeling that came over me that said, you're going to sell this book. So I went to the conference, and what the editor said, one of the manuscripts that I have reviewed shows promise. Walt, it was all I could do not to raise my hand and say, that would be me. It wasn't. It wasn't.
It wasn't.
She had the entire room laughing at what she called the infeasibility of my plot. So you have to understand, I'm a storyteller. I had to learn to be a writer. And if my plot wasn't any good, there was no hope for me. And so here it is, August, when the prime time for Wayne to be working. He's out of work. He's up in Alaska hoping to go out on the pipeline. The kids and I are living on his unemployment check of $150 a week. I went up to the editor afterwards because I was willing to do anything. If I rewrite this book, would you look at it again? I asked her. She looked at me. She put her hand on my arm, stared me straight in the eye and said, throw it away.
Oh, my.
Throw it away.
Well, I mean, not only a rejection, but a rejection in front of everyone. So what happened?
I didn't sleep all night that night. I stayed up, and the shadows on the wall were taunting me, telling me, so you think you're going to be a writer. You think you're going to sell a book. Those voices I grew up with that said, Debbie's a nice little girl, but she's never going to do well. I was so depressed, and I thought, well, if I ever needed to think positive, it was now. So I reached for my Bible, and the reading of the day was John 14. The first verse of John 14 says, let not your heart be troubled. I thought, God, you've got a sense of humor. So the last verse said, arise, let us go from here. So I went right back to that writers' conference and asked for a refund, but they wouldn't give me one. And I thought, I had invested this money. I wasn't going to waste it. So I went to a children's writing workshop because everything I'd sold at this point were articles having to do with the kids. So the editor got up and said, I'm not buying. The agent got up and said, I'm not taking on new clients. And then the writer got up, and she was so encouraging. And she said, if you have not made this much money this year, this is what you need to do. And she had a list of about 8 or 9 things. I only remember one. Do not leave a rejected manuscript on your desk. It has a home. Your job is to find it. Taking that little itty bit of encouragement, I raced home. I wrote a query letter to another publisher and mailed it off. And then I waited every day for an answer. When none came, and here is that manuscript sitting on my desk, taunting me with everything that was there, I thought, I don't care if New York wants to see this or not, I'm mailing it off. Loaded the kids into the station wagon, drove to the post office, and you remember, when you are living on $150 a week, sending a manuscript off that's going to cost you $10 is a lot of money. And I came home, climbed out of the car. Ted ran down to get the mail, and there was a letter from the editor, an answer to my query letter, because I didn't care if they wanted to see it or not. I was mailed it off. And the query letter said, in a Sharpie pen across the top, do not mail us your manuscript. We're not buying at this time. I was sick at heart. I mean, that was my darkest hour. I had invested 5 years of my life, every penny that I could scrounge up to submit a manuscript. The editor had told me to throw it away, and then the publisher said they weren't willing to see it. 3 weeks later, September 29th, New York called and bought the book. Well, if I had waited a half hour, I'd never have mailed that manuscript off.
Wow. And there's more to this story. Our time's running out on this show. But Debbie, I'd like to, and I know our viewers would like to know, where did it go next? Would you be willing to come back?
I sure am.
Let's plan on it next time. So Debbie, thank you, thank you, thank you. Before we end today's program, if you have a comment or a suggestion or an author you'd like me to interview, just email me at insidestory@liftable.tv. That's insidestory@liftable.tv. In addition, if you'd like to subscribe to one of my blogs or my newsletter, just sign up at drwalt.com. That's drwalt.com. So until our next visit, remember the words of the psalmist who wrote, God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. May his and your writing be blessed.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Inside Story, hosted by Walt Larimore. If you have comments about the show or there's an author you'd love to hear from, email Walt at insidestory@liftable.tv.